do is to touch your hearts in the next 20 minutes. I'm not going to try to touch your mind, not because I don't believe you have one, but because touching the heart is always more touching, more memorable. And the subject is a bit daunting to, at first sight, Sanskar, which I want to talk about. But I assure you, it will not be a speech in Sanskrit, nor will it be philosophical to a fault, but it will be anecdotal and a narrative. And my task, I am told, is for about 15 minutes or 20 minutes to tell you a bit about what's been in my mind. And I think it's in everybody's mind. It's just that I have crystallized it into a book. But what I tell you, if it hasn't passed your mind, it's not my fault, something's wrong with you. But I can guarantee it's passed your mind. So let me talk about Sanskar. This is a very interesting word. Most of us know what it means, but we can't explain what exactly it means. Tradition, culture, beliefs, habits, but it's not quite any of these. And if you have a conversation with a foreigner, you realize how difficult it is to translate this word in its totality. Now I'm not going to try to define what is Sanskar, because our audience here is all Indian and each of you understands, I hope, approximately what it means. But I want to use 2 or 3 little narratives to tell you about this, how the Sanskar operates in a way which we don't logically understand. That's why I said I talk to your heart and not to your head. And that's why I wrote the book, which I'll come to in a moment, and then we'll talk about it. I was once, this is about 35 years ago, traveling in the UK for a training course, and an American who thought the world began in Manhattan and ended in Denver. You know, he thought there's nothing beyond Denver, nothing beyond Manhattan. Was in London, seeing there's a new world, and invited me to take him for an Indian meal and introduce him to it, which I did. And then when the food came, I asked for a finger bowl, washed my hand, and how do you eat dal and a roti with a knife and a fork? I haven't figured it out yet. And I did what I've always done. And he was appalled and entered into a rather ferocious discussion, what appeared ferocious to me, an assault on my Indianness, my culture, by saying it's such a lousy habit, how could I possibly eat with my hands? Now when you start to travel internationally and deal with other communities, you learn to explain these things. And I gave the explanation which any of you would give. I don't need to repeat what they were. But I didn't seem to be cutting any ice with him. So finally I told him, you're eating with a knife and a fork. How many people's mouth has that entered before you started eating with it? And he said, I don't know. I said, 20 times a day, this is washed and it goes into other people's mouth. These have not entered anybody's mouth. And this guy said, I never thought of it that way. And said, but we wash the spoon and the fork every time. I said, that's why I asked for the finger bowl, I washed my hands. But I have the confidence, I'm a vegetarian, for good or for bad. I'm not eating some meat or chicken that has gone into somebody else's mouth. Now that's an example on Sanskar. You don't know why you believe, why. I don't know how to eat rasam and rice with a spoon and a fork. Whereas with my bare hands, I can break the laws of physics and centrifuge the whole rasam into my mouth without any difficulty. Even a Punjabi would find it difficult to do that. This is Sanskar. This is the second episode, and I will start. I've got many such episodes. I'll just keep it to 2 to bring out the point of many things in life we just take for granted. You don't think about it. And when somebody talks to you about it, you have difficulty. I joined Hindustan Lever a long time ago, and one of the jobs I did was to be a toothpaste brand manager. When you become a toothpaste brand manager, they teach you to brush your teeth because food particles get stuck in your crevices, and otherwise all sorts of terrible things will happen to you. So I started this habit of carrying a toothbrush in my pocket. So when I go for an office or my training course or come here, if I've had lunch, then after the lunch I would go to the washroom and brush my teeth before I go. I never even thought about the habit, it just was very natural for me. But it's rather an unusual habit. How many of you carry toothbrushes? The American classmate of mine, this was in some management course, came and he saw me at 2 o'clock in the afternoon brushing my teeth. And he said, "Boy, your mom would be so proud if she was here." And rather hesitantly, I told him that I had started my career in a toothpaste company and I learnt this, and that's why I brush my teeth. And he kept watching me brush my teeth, which hasn't happened since I was about 10 years old, or 3 years old rather. So I looked up and he says, "You know what I'm thinking? Thank God you didn't join a condom company." We are in the middle of an onion, and there are rings and rings around the onion, which defines us. And we look at the outside of the onion and judge people. But what's at the core of the onion is what is your sanskar. And I wanted to just make a reference through these little examples. And then I got lots of such examples. So just things that you take for granted and you do. Now, I've defined a little bit about what is sanskar. Second subject I was very interested in is what makes people or institutions long living. Now, if it's a human being, there are doctors who will study it and say, don't drink alcohol, do deep breathing. So that's not my area. My area is companies. What makes a company long living? And a company is an institution. Dynasties are institutions. Governments, nations, societies are institutions. So institutional long living caught my attention. And I did a lot of study and research on that out of my own professional interest. And amongst the 5 lessons or the mantras for Ayurveda of institutions, if I can use the word, long life of institution, one of them is a deep sense of identity. The institution has a deep sense. So if you're in Tata has been there for 150 years, people in Tata have a deep sense of identity, whatever that may be. So I got interested now into some sanskar. I went to identity. Now what is identity? And I said, how do we identify ourselves? So at the core of my onion, for example, yes, I am a Tamil. I belong to some particular caste or group within that. But I am also an Indian. I am also a manager. I am also an employee of Tata or Levers. I am also an international global citizen. And I am, as Amartya Sen said, all of that at the same time and playing different roles. Now, my sense of identity as to who I am comes out of my family. There's nothing distinctive about my family except for myself. And what did my ancestors, who do they come, where did they come from, where did they go? How did I? This is a perpetual interest in mankind. For a long time, every person sitting in this room and every person not sitting in this room is very deeply interested. And if any of your elders in your family tell you, you know, your great-grandfather was a trader in Kathiawad and he took a boat and went to Africa, something happened, you're very, very interested. And you say, I wish I would know more. So I got into this bug, and now I'm coming to my book, that I want to know where my ancestors came from, but there's a limited amount of information you can get about your ancestors. Unlike the British who have church records and they can go and dig into. Even I was born in 1945, but I don't have a birth certificate. When I got married, I didn't get a marriage certificate. So when I went to Saudi Arabia, I already had 3 children. The Saudi embassy insisted on producing a marriage certificate. I produced my 3 children. And he said, that's entirely possible without marriage. So that challenged my sense of identity. So I got a marriage certificate which is 14 years after my marriage, with retrospective effect as it were. So in the absence of records, when my father was alive, I went through a large number of interviews with my father, my uncle, my aunt, and virtually they said as soon as Gopal finished the interviewing, that relation dies, you know. I sort of captured all the stuff I could. And then I also bought a large number of books on what was happening in the country and society at those points of time. Because our entire sanskar has come through word of mouth. So there's nothing wrong with this. What would be the history of this country if you didn't have what Fa Hien said, or what Hyun Sang said, or what Marco Polo wrote, Ibn Battuta? Those records have helped us to, apart from archaeological stuff. So I reconstructed, and I've got back in my family to 1820. And what I've done in the book is not to talk about what Ranganathan told Ranganayaki on a Monday afternoon in the village. That's no interest to anybody. But to see the world through their eyes. They became the Sutradhars. So in the book, it's called a comma in a sentence. And it's called a comma in a sentence because 200 years looks very long. But frankly, it's a very short period because there have been ancestors and ancestors before that. My eyesight and my vision could not get beyond 200 years. For example, in a little village in Tanjore, how did they get information that in 1857 something was happening in Delhi? There was no newspaper, there was no lit fest, there was no radio. How do you get information? And I've touched upon that. And I have touched upon, for example, we think that our life is getting very complex due to technological change. That's the biggest myth. Because technological change has threatened people for a long, long time. So what happened when my ancestor, great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather, saw a steam engine? He said, oh my God, this monstrous thing will go all the way from Tanjore to Madras in 8 hours. A journey that used to take 6 days. But what was his worry? His worry was, how will I put my string around my thread around my ear and where will I get a lota? Where will I get the water? And if I don't do that, then of course I'm not a true Brahmin or whatever. What happened when they saw the first newspaper? That was in 1873, a newspaper, Tamil newspaper called Swadeshamitran was starting to get published. Once in a week it would come. A postcard, we all take it for granted. What happened to the first postcard? All those I have tried to describe and reconstruct the world. What happened when the Great Madras famine took place in 1877? How did it affect life in the village? Because those are the real tribulations and changes that the ancestors went through, and each of your ancestors has had this. It's just that you haven't taken the trouble to reconstruct it. And then how did the migration begin? What caused the family to go away from the village and come into cities? My father did that. He came to Kolkata. What was Kolkata like in 1931? And for the first time, my father, who had a pigtail, as good Brahmins did, and didn't speak a word beyond good Tamil, modest English, and zero Hindi or Bengali. When he came to Calcutta, how did he see the Bengalis? How did life change? And luckily I have been able to reconstruct all of this. And of course I've ended the book saying, reflecting back on these 200 years and saying it's not unique to my family. Every person in this room and outside belongs to a family. Instead of Ranganathan and Ranganayaki, it will be Ranchodbhai or Bachubai or somebody in Punjab. Some families might have gone through very traumatic experiences like partition, but everybody's been through a certain experience, and that explains who you are, why you are, where you are. And of course, you are weighed down with the thought that you have to leave. You are only a transmitter of Sanskar. You've taken Sanskar and you have to give it to your children and grandchildren. And I wrote this book with the fond hope that will make many people, ordinary people. I'm an ordinary guy. I'm not from the Nehru family. I'm not from any big family. And I'm like anybody else. There are 300 million middle class people, 400 million middle class people in this country. And I'm saying what an enormous societal change has happened. If each of us would write, even if it's for your own family, even if they don't publish it, what a treasure you leave. And it's my hope, maybe my grandson will pick up the story from now. So instead of 200 years, he'll have 300 years. And if people wrote this, it provides a great addition to the pool of social discourse and knowledge in this country. Not everything was perfect, but that's besides the point. So that's the context in which I wrote the book. But I had one big insight which I'd like to say, and then I'll close for our conversation. Most of us think of India with the statistics that are produced. So 5% or 7%, depending on which year you're discussing, in GDP growth. 1.2 billion, 80% Hindus, 12% Muslims, something, Christians, Parsis, Punjab, Tamil, Bengali, Assamese. But actually I got a very different view about India as I started to write this book. And it is not unknown. The moment I tell you, you will say, of course that's known, but you have not thought of it that way. Everybody in India is a minority. There is no majority in India. Now this had a very profound implication for me. Why do I say this? Now I'm going to describe myself for 2 seconds, only to illustrate the point, but each of you can relate it to your own situation. So I'm a Tamil. I'm a Tamil Brahmin. Within the Brahmin there are Iyengars. I'm an Iyengar. Within the Iyengar there's a Vadagale, and I'm a Vadagale. Now if you want to know more about this complicated structure, you'll have to read my book. Huh? It won't tell you too much, other than that I am that. But each of you is that. You are a Khatri within the Khatri. In UP, I am told that there are 15 million Brahmins. But they are in 20 categories. Saraswats, there are millions of Saraswat Brahmins. But there are 17 categories of Saraswat Brahmins. By the way, the smallest of them is called Chandrapur Saraswat Brahmin, and they have estimated there are only 80,000 of them. So who said the Parsis is the only one who are a threatened species? My own community, there are only 200,000 worldwide. So I suddenly said, now why is it relevant? In America also there are immigrants. But in this country, until 50 years ago, you married only within your community. You know, in my father's time, the question of marrying outside the community just didn't arise. In my time, maybe jara dhakka marke, but in my children's time, it's the other way around. And if you ask them to marry in the community, it will sound like it's crazy. But these people are only 5% of the population. 95% of the people in this country still marry. Otherwise, the Khap Panchayat would have been dead. So, here's the world's original sociological museum, in one sense, where we are 1,000 communities of 1 million people each. That's how the 1 billion comes. If you do the maths, you'll find out. Can you imagine any other society or country like that? 1,000 communities. And I thought all Rajasthanis were Rajasthanis, not being from that area. Then I was told there's a musician category there. I don't know what it's called in the Rajasthani language. You might know this better. Now within the musician community, I'm told there are Langas, Saperas, Bhopas, Jogis, Manganiyas. And I'm told they will not, in a traditional sort of sense, intermarry. And so it goes on in every category. So, India is a land where everybody is a minority. I want to bring this to the notice of the Minorities Commission so that their scope of work is made even more complicated than it already is. And I'm hoping that by writing this book, I am bringing a message to very, very ordinary people, and all of us are very ordinary, that if you have this urge, which is bound to be in you, you might have suppressed it. मैं कहाँ से आया? मैं कहाँ जा रहा हूँ? What is it? The amanat. You're not leaving wealth for your children. That's incidental. You're leaving sanskar for your children. And you have to start to understand and define that sanskar. And in a very, very, very small way, maybe if you all read my book, you'll find a little inspiration to do your own thing and develop the sanskar of yours. So thank you for listening to me.
This is the book, A Comma in a Sentence. And he just mentioned very briefly on why he chose that title. I wanted to point out, I was reading through some of the parts of the book, and it says that every narration in this book is real. It's about real characters, real people, real situations and happenings. And you have gone back 200 years in tracing your grandfather and your grandfather's grandfather. And you've highlighted a few characters who you found more interesting than some. Would you say that a lot of the book is also your own personal journey that you were trying to sort of dig up and get into the past? Or is it also to use it as a lens for future generations to say, in discovering about myself, I'm letting the world know about so many other things?
I must narrate very briefly how see, everything in India is passed on by word of mouth. Who said that Krishna said whatever he said to Arjuna? There is no manuscript. So through word of mouth, that is why there is this great interest sociologically that children should be learned by rote. Why are you taught by rote? We criticize it today in our modern system of education, but it has played a role. And therefore I put some value to oral history. So the first thing was I was respectful of that, and I started to interview All my relations, as I said before, one by one they passed away. And I accepted the oral history as a point of view. That's what oral history is. Even Trevelyan wrote that history is one man's prejudice. So if my father told me that his grandfather was a very talkative, inquisitive, outgoing, extroverted person, I've tried to capture that in the character of Ushi Veeraraghavan in the book. So that's for real. But how did I get interested to even do this? I had an epiphany. I had an experience. In 1954, when my grandfather's parents were alive, I went to the village. We all used to go as kids. There was no electricity in those days, and we learned for the first time to prepare for NCC camps. Take a lota and go out into the fields. Later on, when I did this in NCC, it seemed to be quite easy to do. Then I went in 1984, 30 years later. By this time, everybody had passed away, and I was going for old time's sake. Mine is a very, very small and obscure village. And those days it had a population of 3,000, today it's 4,000. So it's not that it hasn't grown. People had large families, but they all came away to other cities. But when I went to the village, this could happen to any of you, by the way, without an intention to meet anybody, as I've described in the book, an old widow came out of her thatched hut and she looked at me like this and said, "Who are you looking for?" in Tamil. To which I responded and I said, "Nobody in particular, I'm just looking around." And she muttered under her breath rather disrespectfully, "No guy in his right senses comes to this village to just look around." She's right. And then she squinted at me and said, "You know, you have the look and the gait of Rajam." Rajam was my father's name in the village. "Are you by any chance related to him?" And of course I identified myself. At which stage she clapped her hands or did something. She sent an SMS message, I'm not sure what she did. But a whole lot of people arrived. With names like Badrinarayan and Ranganathan and Swaminath, saying, "I'm your cousin." And they opened up the temple. My parents, my ancestors had been priests in the temple. And there was a special aarti done for me, like I'm a returning prodigal son to the village. And I felt a great sense of epiphany. This will happen to you. If you went to your village and you opened up, you know how our temples are constructed to be cavernous and resonant with it. And that's how I got on this journey. So I've captured characters who are real. I think all that I've done is perhaps by putting it into a historical context, like the conversation between Ushi Veeraraghavan and his father about the 1857 events in some faraway place in the north. They were totally unconnected with it. It's based also on real facts. But I've held it together with a little sauce, like you make aviyal or mutton curry or whatever, with a gravy. And I've created the gravies of imagination. I must use the imagination. That's all it's not my personal journey. For some of these journeys that I've described here, what did it feel like to go from Velakudi to Manargudi? I actually took the walk.
And how long was that?
It took me, I must say I cheated a bit. I took car for a while, I walked for a while. It took me about a couple of hours, 2-3 hours. Because I cheated a bit. I had already taken 4 or 5 hours. Likewise, I have described what happened in Calcutta, in the Upper Chitpur Road, which is a fantastic place. Though it was many years later, I walked around, saw the monuments, went through it, reconstructed it in my mind. So to that extent, there is imagination.
I wanted to fast forward a little bit. You've got an interesting chapter which says LPR to LPG in the 21st century. So I'll just spell out what LPR to LPG is, and we'd really like your experiences, given that first you chronicled so much of your family history and the times that they lived in, and then your own personal experience between the LPR regime to the LPG regime. So I think Mr. GopalaKrishnan has brought it down very beautifully. It says the LPR regime in India was the license, permit, regulation regime. When you needed a license or a permit and everything was regulated in India. And the second part was the LPG regime. That's not your LPG cylinder. It's liberalization, privatization, globalization. And how his career has seen vast areas in both regimes. Some words on that, sir, on how do you relate that to the way the current economy, people, society, how both these regimes, in your view, have influenced, where we are today? As people, our values, our traditions.
Well, a lot of things have changed and a lot of things are in flux. We tend to despair about India, but I am an incurable optimist about what's happening in this country is fantastic. But that's not the subject of the book, so I'll get back to your question. But I'll just take one example, otherwise I'll end up making an extended speech, so I want to avoid that. When I was young and growing up, in the first 20 years of my career, we had this license permit Raj system. I remember I used to listen very carefully to CEOs of companies, owners of businesses. And two messages I remember very well. That if you want to be a CEO, which I did want to be when I was a kid, younger, you must learn to deal with Delhi. So people would state with pride, I've got a permanent guest house in Delhi, or I go 3 times a week on Indian Airlines, which would inevitably be late. And that's the main job of the CEO. Karkhana chalana koi aur sambhalega. The entrepreneurs, many of them were of your community, but this has nothing to do with their being in your community. The entrepreneurs would say, देखो, I am the owner of the company. मेरा काम है सरकार को संभालना. बाकी वो लोग, they are there. Like that, also that doesn't matter. You know, marketing and production and purchasing, smart. That has changed. It has changed, not dramatically. I mean, you haven't reached the stage where you say, I don't give a damn what's happening in Delhi. You can't afford to do that because Mr. Kejriwal pops up under your nose and reminds you that you better take note of it. But it has dramatically shifted. Today, if I had to talk to young people and said, you want to be a CEO and you must learn to manage Delhi, I would say it in a much softer tone. And if he's going 3 times a week to Delhi, I'll say you'll never become a CEO. I mean, taking a very practical sort of example. And the globalization part has become much bigger. It was not at all considered essential in my younger days to know about the rest of the world because it didn't matter. We are India, we are very different. But in the second half, I said now, it's all going the same way. So if you want to be, if you're 30 today and you want to be a CEO when you're 50, you better take interest in the G part of it. That's one example.
Certainly, certainly. There's an interesting part in the book where you have described again the evolution of society and our values as you have seen through the eyes of your family's evolution over the generations. I think one of the examples you mentioned is how today's children in this generation are taking it for granted that, you know, everyone will go to college and to university and maybe, you know, do a postgraduate degree or even further. But that wasn't the case earlier. And you elaborated about how we've all become MUL. So why don't you shed some light on MUL and how you see that going ahead, you know, in terms of society and values?
Just to clarify, MUL stands for not Maruti Udyog Limited, but Modern, Urban and Liberal. You know, PLUs, people like us, who think they are MUL, until the crunch comes and then you find that there are lots of traditional things in you as well. I just want to say that this point about Sanskar, I have tried to granularize in this last chapter which you referred to. I mean, every family has Sanskar, every individual has Sanskar. And it is not that your Sanskar is 100% different from mine, you know, 75% will be common. And in fact, I have outlined what those are in my case. And I'll be surprised if most of you don't see it, to hamare mein bhi hai. First, the art of family conversations. Second, a multicultural adaptation. My father had to adapt from being a Tamil speaking person to being a very badly speaking Hindi, Bengali person, but he had to survive in Calcutta. In my case, I have to do something different, and my daughter speaks Spanish. She went to learn it. Third, commitment to education, which is a very middle class value, which is what is lifting these 300 million people into the middle class. Fourth is deliberately developing a liberal attitude. You know, I remember when I was in school, I had a Jesuit father who taught me Sanskrit. I mean, it's quite remarkable. And Father Antoine said, you, and I was 10 years old, to study Sanskrit at 10 sounds rather complicated even by today's standards, but we did. And he said, you are the inheritors of a great tradition which you should never forget. It's called Swikriti. And Swikriti means, I'll do my thing, you do your thing. And I will not have a value judgment on your thing, you don't have a value judgment on my thing. So if I fall on my knees and pray 5 times a day, you can take out your lota and do 3 times Sandhya Vandanam. We can coexist. That's how this country, which has always had 1,000 sub communities, has coexisted. And that is what I mean by saying deliberately, in an age today when we tend to be more fractious, you have to work on developing that liberal attitude. And the last one is morality and corruption. We think that we are going through the worst times of public morality and corruption. That is not true. I'm not saying we could carry on carrying with the corruption and morality that we have, but I've alluded to the fact that in every country, the United States, in the UK, in this equivalent stage of society, they went through the same thing. And so I call India Benjamin Button. If you've seen the movie Benjamin Button, little baby is born with a very old face. And as the baby grows up, the face gets younger and younger. So we are in one sense 5,000 years old. In another sense we are 60 years of independence.
True.
But in another sense, which is the real sense that you touch every morning, you're a democratic capitalist country only for the last 20 years.
Yep.
So we are an adolescent country. And if your daughter or son is an adolescent and acts a bit wonky, you don't chop off her head. You don't say there's no hope for this. You don't migrate to become an NRI. You support your child to get through adolescence. And India is going through adolescence. It requires the maturity of the middle class and the educated class to see it through that. And I've touched upon some of the pragmatic aspects of it without becoming preachy. I hope.
No, not at all. There's an interesting part I was seeing where you've identified what are those areas which contribute to happiness.
And then you've gone and given some really nice quotes from various movies and poems as well, which I think have struck a chord with you in terms of how they contribute to happiness, to human beings, and how it relates to the various values you've spoken about. Do you want to share a few minutes around what you believe contributes to human happiness with regards to the Sanskars that you have spoken about in the book?
I hope I don't sound like Sadguru Jaggi Vasudeva or somebody. I'm going to talk about this in a pragmatic sort of way.
Sure.
If I want to become Sri Ravi Shankar's successor, I've still got, that will be my next career, not yet. No, I must tell you, first of all, just by way of fact, I'm not making a virtue out of it, and I'm not trying to wear it on my sleeve or crib about it. But we, my brothers and sisters and I, are the first graduates in our family. Until my father's time, nobody had gone to college. My sister is the first woman graduate. Education was given to us because my father broke the sort of chain and did a few things which are described in the book, which enabled us to get this education. In turn, our children have gone to Stanford. They don't talk anything less than Stanford, Harvard, Boston, They can't believe that my parents didn't go to college. They can't believe that we didn't have an iPod or whatever, So there's a generational gap. This point about happiness is related to contentedness. You see, there are two opposite sides of the same coin. It's the same coin. You can't be happy if you're not contented. Whereas what we are always fed is you must always be discontented so that you can achieve bigger and bigger things. Both are true.
True.
You can't say one is wrong and the other is right. But one of the things I have observed is more and more people, of the 7 billion people on this planet, are in search of happiness. It's always been the case, by the way. Otherwise, our acharyas would not have written and propagated what they did. Aristotle would not have contemplated on the subject of happiness. But it seems to me there is more turmoil, more uljan. And I came across a study which I've referred to in the book, which is the world's longest sociological study. It started in 1938 or 42, I forget. When John F. Kennedy was one of the young boys studying in Harvard, there were other very well-known people. He took the Harvard class of that year. There were 240 people. They all agreed to enroll in a study on happiness. And since then, till many of them are not dead and gone, they were, at every 3 years, some psychological study was done, some physiological study. It's all lying in a vault in Washington. And one particular journalist was allowed access to say, what does it all mean? And he wrote in the Atlantic Journal, which I've referred to here, a very fine article. Now, he says there are 5 things you need to be happy. And you say, wow, multi-year research, world's longest sociological. What does he say? He says, don't have excessive habits. Smoking, drinking, drugs, whatever you do. No excesses. Second one, I'm not going to go through all of them, because you'll say there's no need to go through all of them, don't I know this, is don't put on weight. The third one is be very adaptable. You have to change with the times that come. The fourth one is keep in touch. Your life is about relationships. People who keep in touch with their school friends, college friends. I don't want to comment on marriage, whether you should be married to the same person or not, but that becomes a value judgment. But keep in touch with old connections. There are some people for whom that's a past life. They're not in touch with school friends, college friends, nothing. Or family. You need connections, human connections. These are the people who become happy. Now, I then ask myself, why do you need to do 75 years of research to figure this out? I mean, this is there. It's been written about for a long, long time. It's so difficult to practice it. And that's what I meant when I said happiness, when you refer to the happiness part. And then something happened to me, which has happened or will happen for sure to all of you. In our village, there's a Tamil word called Thinnai. Thinnai means a little platform at the outside of the house, where the master of the house would sit every afternoon. And he would watch the going on. This is equivalent to standing in the balcony and watching the buses go, BFT buses go in Bombay. We don't have a Thinnai, but I was sitting on what I call an unja, a swing, and I was watching the traffic outside my house. And my mind went back. I suddenly got into a trance, or a dream, I would say. And I thought of my grandfather's grandfather sitting on the Thinnai in the village. And those thoughts came to my mind, which I then sat down and wrote down, because I got obsessed with the idea. My daughter and son-in-law, I have a British son-in-law. My daughter-in-law is half Punjabi and half Goan, and my other son-in-law is a Sikh. So, that's multicultural as much as you want. And I said, how will they be in 2050? They'll be the age that I am now at that time. And my grandchildren are there, they're playing there, and I said, my God, this is not going to be 2 years old, this kid is going to be 32 years old. Will he speak English? Will he speak Tamil? Will he speak Java? Will he speak at all? Or will he just sit with his iPod and keep doing this? People will speak with their fingers. They may not, the larynx may vanish in evolution. And as I thought about it, I was concerned for my descendants, because I said life is getting too complicated, and how will people survive all this? And then I recalled that all my ancestors were worried about the next generation. Every one of them.
Right.
But it turned out okay. And I remember this lovely song, which everybody has heard, from Alfred Hitchcock's movie, The Man Who Knew Too Much. I was in school at that time. The Man Who Knew Too Much in 1955 or 56. Hey, Sara, Sara. Whatever will be, will be. The future is not ours to see. And I said, that's the only way to be happy. Not keep obsessing how your children are going to grow up. Not to get worked up that she wants to marry somebody or she's raising her child that way. But to let her find her own freedom. The only thing that you can do is to see, have you instilled that sanskar in her? And if you have, lay off. And I've described how that sanskar, I feel, has been instilled in my children, which is probably happening in every middle class family, but a little awareness of it will do two good things: create more happy families, and if you read my book, it will increase my sales also.
You very beautifully described, how, let's say there was a caste system earlier. So there were Brahmins earlier and Kshatriyas, and now how you see that same caste system emerging, but in a different context. If you could spend a minute or two on that, and how you have seen it, whilst you're writing the book, and today as well.
I don't want to make any contentious statement, because caste is a very loaded word these days.
Sure.
But I do want to make a statement of fact. Caste has existed and will continue to exist in every society, everywhere in the world. And I've quoted how they define caste. And by the way, the caste has wise men, it has fighters, it has people who make the money, and it has people who do the work. They got different names, and I've given the words used in Latin and Spanish and so on. What has gone wrong with our caste system is it became immutable. That if you were born into this, only you could do that, you could not change. That has been shaken up for a good thing. I think it's a very good thing. So today I have my cousins, and even I have done it in my career, good Brahmin, wearing the thread, but selling fish or running a leather factory making shoes. And you don't care anymore, because that's your job. You're running a leather factory, you happen to study leather technology. Conversely, and nobody's asked me, are you a Brahmin, how are you doing? I just did my job. Conversely, there are people who might be born into Saudi, all Kshatriyas are not fighting wars, and so on and so forth. I think it's a very positive thing. We've probably just started the journey, and much more has to be done to break down the rigidity of our caste. But I can see the emergence of a different kind of caste system. When you look around Bombay, all the investment bankers, there are Bombay Gymkhana types. There are the Swiss set of Bandra, then there are the Swiss set of Colaba, right? You go to the Taj, I'm very grateful for their business because I earn my salary out of Tata's earning money. But you go to the Taj at 11 o'clock in the night on a Saturday, you find all these kids spending money like the blazes. They spend as much as 5 times the starting salary I had when I began my career, without batting an eyelid. Now if you say, oh, the younger generation is going to the dogs, this is terrible, you'll be the unhappy man. The younger generation don't give a damn. Life has changed, the context has changed. If they're earning, they want to live. Nothing wrong with it. So I want to conclude that part about what you asked by saying the caste system became too rigid. It continues to be a bit rigid because 90% are still living in that world. It's only 10% who have got off that. 90% are still living in that world. And we need to continue this journey as a society, as a nation to break it down. A new form of caste will come. But whatever form of caste comes, so long as it's mutable and not immutable, I think it's the reality that you'll find anywhere in the world. I always say, for example, all Bengalis, they either become economists, journalists, or communists. That's a caste system. If there are any Bengalis here, forgive me, I'm a Bengali. I'm a good Bengali, I was born and raised in Calcutta. Nobody can be more Bengali than I am. So I think I'm entitled to say it.
Even I'm born in Bengal, so you know.
Thank you so much, sir. It's been a pleasure to have you. And in order to have this session, I did, go through the book, and I'm telling you, it's a really nice read. Usually when you pick up a book and you say, well, it's a title which says a comma in a sentence, you might assume that it's a very literary book, about writing or about literature, but it's not. It is an amazing book because he's used it as a lens to give us a view of the world, how it has been in the last 200 years in India, family values, aspirations, traditions, and ultimately Sanskars. So do urge you to go and buy it. Thank you. Thanks.